Welcome to Nice and Blunt. These are my tight end and defensive rankings for Week 10. If you're watching this early, thank you for joining the Blunt rotation. If you're watching this on Friday, if you want early access, you can join down below for just $4.20 a month. But let's get into it. There are some players on bye and injured this week. At tight end, we are missing a few typical names. Like, sadly, Tucker Kraft is out for the year. He's on IR, and that's a big bummer. He was looking like an elite tight end, but I kind of feel like it was a bit of a fluke. Kraft had such good matchups every single week that was kind of inflating his production a little bit. I felt like he was kind of due for a regression. We will never find out, though, now that he is on IR. But Brenton Strange of the Jaguars is on IR for one more game. I would expect him back in Week 11. His timeline to return said he would miss Week 10, but be back in Week 11. There's also 4 teams on bye: Jake Ferguson of the Cowboys, Travis Kelce of the Chiefs, Chigo Okonkwo of the Tennessee Titans, and Noah Fant of the Bengals. None of them are ranked. So at least with Ferguson and Kelce, 2 top 10 tight ends are unavailable, and you might be needing to replace them off the waiver wire. But let us begin. Let's get into it with the matchup stats. And as always, this graph shows you every single matchup in the NFL and how many points per game they're allowing to the tight end position. In blue, we have the season-long stats, 2025, how many points per game have been allowed by every team. And then in red, we're looking at the last 4 games specifically. In general, we're chasing the matchups that give up at least 11.5, 12-plus points per week. So unfortunately, the number one matchup is on bye this week. The Cincinnati Bengals have been by far the best matchup, not just on the year, but especially in the last month. Those touchdown receptions have been hitting every single week. Loveland finally has breakout, and honestly, I think it was more a product of the Bengals matchup than the Bears offense trusting Colston Loveland. So sadly, no major upgrade this week. Cincinnati is off the slate, but the next best matchup on the year have allowed 16 plus points per game to the position, and Oronde Gadsden should have a great game in primetime against Pittsburgh. Definitely a big upgrade for Oronde Gadsden. Third best matchup has been amazing lately. The Jaguars defense is trash as of this moment, so Dalton Schultz should have a very good game. I don't care that Davis Mills is the quarterback. The Jaguars cannot stop tight ends. But last week, Bowers had 3 touchdowns and well over 100 yards. Bowers is kind of a unicorn, and maybe this matchup is not as good as those stats would suggest. But still, on paper, you trust tight ends against Jacksonville. I would still start Dalton Schultz with some confidence. He is in my top 12 based on this upgrade. I would consider him more valuable. The Dolphins have been a good matchup, so Dalton Kincaid should have another great game. Love Kincaid this week. And then, surprise, surprise, Kyle Pitts might be a great option. Kyle Pitts, not a safe start in general, but this Colts matchup has been extremely vulnerable. In the last month, it's up to 21.1 points per game. However, that matchup against Oronde Gadsden, where he had 170 plus yards, kind of factors in here. I don't know if it's that good, but in general, you want to be starting tight ends against Indianapolis. There should be some high-end production. And if you go back to Kyle Pitts' career, when he's played in Europe, he has actually had some amazing games. His first 100-yard performance was in a London matchup. Perhaps in Europe, he also steps up again. At number 6, we have Sam LaPorta getting a very good matchup against Washington. They've been trash on defense this year, and lately even easier for tight ends. So I like Sam LaPorta a lot. Last week, you definitely gained some confidence starting him. And then the next best matchup goes to A.J. Barner and Elijah Arroyo. I think I trust Barner a little bit more. However, Arizona is just good for all tight ends. I could see both of them having a good game. Last week, they both scored a touchdown. It's definitely possible to happen again, but Arroyo seems like a bit more of a deep threat. Barner feels a bit more involved in the offense, regardless of what the game script would dictate. So I like A.J. Barner the most, but Arroyo also gets an upgrade against Arizona. Green Bay has been a good matchup for tight ends, so Dallas Goedert has been phenomenal this year. I would definitely start Dallas Goedert. And then the Vikings are also a good spot here, so Mark Andrews should play well. There should be a touchdown available for either him or Isaiah Likely. Likely is starting to get more involved, but I don't trust him yet. I would still only start Andrews in the Ravens offense at tight end. The Patriots have been a good matchup, relatively speaking. So Cade Otton, at the very least, gets a neutral matchup. I'm definitely not downgrading Cade Otton. The Patriots are a top 10 spot on the year. And then Trey McBride is a lock in lineup every week, but the Seahawks have been a solid matchup all season. So I do like McBride in this game a little extra. And then Jatavion Sanders, maybe you're willing to trust this upgrade, but has not performed well. The Saints against Jatavion probably don't offer enough of an upgrade to endorse Jatavion in your lineup. But on paper, it's not the worst spot. In the same matchup, Carolina is getting a bit tougher against the position lately, down to 8.1 points, but on the season, a top 13 matchup for Juwan Johnson. Maybe this is the week, though, where Taysom Hill finally has a breakout. I feel like it's coming, but I've been saying that for a couple weeks now. I am hyped on Taysom Hill. At some point, he'll pay off. But next up, the Bears defense is pretty bogus in general, so the matchup for Theo Johnson and Daniel Bellinger is fine. No worries for them. Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper get a solid matchup as well. No concern there, but sometimes Hooper does vulture you. I would trust Hunter Henry, though. I think he's a good play against the Bucs. The Cowboys have been a solid matchup, but they're on bye, so that's irrelevant. And then these next three are also in the neutral zone. We have TJ Hockenson against Baltimore. Hasn't been safe enough to start. Even with a touchdown last week, the upside was still kind of capped. Zach Ertz, much more appealing when Jaden Daniels is the starter, but with no Terry McLaurin, maybe I'll trust him even with Mariota. And then Colston Loveland coming off a great game against the Giants, probably not as exciting, but the Giants have been giving up very good stats lately, up to 13.5 points per game to the position in the last month. So maybe you're feeling confident with Loveland, but I would like to see him do it again in a matchup that's not Cincinnati. The Bengals matchup, I think, is really the reason why Loveland played so well. But Tennessee is a solid matchup lately. They are on bye, so no relevance this week. Denver against Brock Bowers. You're always starting Bowers, so these stats expect them to go up after the Bowers game. And then the Niners have been somewhat decent. Not a great matchup for the Rams tight end. So Tyler Higbee splitting time with the other tight ends. Him and Terrence Ferguson, I think, are the most appealing. But Davis Allen and even Colby Parkinson factor in. So not safe to trust a Rams tight end. But George Kittle in an equally tough matchup against the Rams. You're probably still going to start him regardless, especially if Purdy comes back. I would expect better chemistry with the quarterback. And then Harold Fannin and David Njoku don't get a great matchup against the Jets. However, it has been a little easier. In the last month, it does rank closer to league average. But the Chiefs have been a tough matchup this year. On bye, it doesn't matter. No team is facing Kansas City. Chargers have been a relatively tough spot on the season, so not going to trust Johnny Smith or Pat Freiermuth. The Steelers tight end core is a bit random. And then Hunter Long, never starting him until Brenton Strange comes back. The Jags don't offer value at tight end, so not going to start him against Houston. Not a good matchup there. And then Evan Engram, not in a good matchup against the Raiders, so generally just a floor play. I don't think you upgrade Engram against Las Vegas this week. Luke Musgrave will have to step up with no Kraft, but the Eagles have really limited opposing tight ends this season, so not expecting 10 plus points from Musgrave in this game. And then in the bottom two, the Bills are a very big downgrade, but Tanner Connor of the Dolphins, not going to start him. If it's not Darren Waller, I have no interest in the Dolphins tight end. And then the last matchup goes to Tyler Warren. The Falcons are averaging just 4 points allowed to opposing tight ends. Not a single touchdown on the season. And last week against Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper was the first time they gave up more than 40 yards to the position. So maybe the matchup stats are irrelevant, but in general, you do not trust Tyler Warren as much in a bad matchup like Atlanta. So that is it for the stats. Let's break down my rankings at the position. In general, there are some obvious names that you're always starting at the top. Like after Bowers' 3 touchdown performance last week, he is clearly the tight end 1. I ranked him at 1 because I believed he did have that talent, and the injury was the only thing holding him back. It's about time he's back on the field, and holy Bowers, he was worth the wait. So I'm sure you're ecstatic if you held strong and just kept Bowers on your bench, waited for him to get healthy. It was totally worth it. And that game was just so impressive. There is no way I'm ranking Bowers not at number 1. But Trey McBride has been consistent all season long. He is the tight end 1 overall in fantasy. And because Brissett has taken over, the touchdowns have been there. 4 touchdown receptions for McBride in his last 3 games with Brissett. Love to see that. That is exactly what I want. As someone who has McBride in a full PPR league, he is just money in the bank. He is so safe, such a good producer, and with touchdowns now a consistent factor for him, boy, he is just such a safe play. Love McBride. Locked into the top 2. We drafted these guys top 2. I will stick with them at 1 and 2. But LaPorta had an amazing game last week, and the matchup is top 10 for him. The Commander just gave up 2 touchdowns to Elijah Arroyo and AJ Barner last week. So love LaPorta. Should be a great game for Jared Goff. And when he has elite production, it's because players like LaPorta and JMO are contributing. I would expect that to happen this week for Sam LaPorta. I like the upside. He's my tight end 3 in a great matchup versus Washington. But at number 4, George Kittle has not quite lived up to the draft capital. Since coming back from injury, it's expected he's not 100%. But I think the thing that's missing the most is Brock Purdy. So I'm assuming Purdy comes back this week. Even if he doesn't, I still am not going to lower Kittle in the ranks. I think as he gets healthier, the upside will be there. And he's due for like a major blow-up game. At some point, he's going to offer you like 85, 90 yards and a touchdown. So I'm still starting Kittle. I'm definitely not benching him. But he hasn't quite lived up to that elite 3rd round draft capital since coming back from the hamstring injury. So he is a bit older. Maybe that's one of the factors, but at some point he's going to be due for a big blow up. I still have him top 5. I'm not going to be benching George Kittle if I have him. At number 5, we have Dallas Goedert at Green Bay. The matchup against the Packers is top 10, and especially with the red flags of AJ Brown this season, Goedert has been a focal point in the offense. So not going to worry about his production. Definitely a lot of value headed his way. And although the weather's a bit cold in this game, it's not going to be enough of a factor to downgrade him enough. So if you have Goedert, he's been a lock in the lineup, very productive this year. And the matchup indicates he will go over 10 points. So expecting a touchdown, expecting 50 plus yards. Goedert has been a very good tight end this season. And I will continue to start him if I have him off the bye. He should be fully healthy. It should be a great start. Yet again. At number 6, I did drop Tyler Warren down a full tier, but he's still at the top because he's been so matchup proof and really productive this season. But the Falcons are the toughest spot all season. No touchdowns allowed to opposing tight ends. It's been brutal, and they only allow an average of 4 points per game to the position. So definitely a lower ceiling is my projection for Warren, but if you told me it didn't matter, if you told me the Colts offense still drops 30, 40 points and Warren finds the end zone, wouldn't surprise me at all. I'm not going to bench him, but I have to drop him in the rankings because the matchup is a tough one. If you get the toughest spot, I can't upgrade you respective to your elite peers. So I'd rather go Goedert, I'd rather go Kittle, I'd rather go LaPorta, and then obviously McBride and Bowers, I think are better plays. But at number 6, Warren is still in your lineup, still top 10, still a must start. You can't fade him too much. But at number 7, I would like to rank Kincaid higher. After last week, you're definitely encouraged. But there have been a lot of up and down performances. Kincaid is kind of yo-yoed in terms of fantasy production. And if you told me this is a heavy James Cook performance, wouldn't shock me if there are very few passing touchdowns available in this matchup. So you could get vultured by Josh Allen rushing in touchdowns. Same with James Cook. And if the passing touchdowns go elsewhere, it wouldn't shock me at all if Kincaid lays an egg and falls back down under 5 points. That's kind of been the case. He has one great game and then one brutal game. And because of that lack of consistency, even though the matchup is great for him, it ranks top 4, I just could see game script going elsewhere. The Bills offense is a bit too random to know exactly what you're going to get, but I'm ranking him at number 7. I'm not telling you to bench Kincaid. I just can't rank him above some of those elite options I have in the top 6. But at 7, got to start him. The matchup indicates you should get 12 plus points from Kincaid against the Dolphins. At number 8, we have Oronde Gadsden versus Pittsburgh, who gets the best matchup on paper this week. The Steelers cannot stop opposing tight ends. And if we're just looking at the law of averages, you'd get about 16 points from Gadsden this week. But if you don't get the touchdown, I doubt you'll go over 11 points. Gadsden, though, is giving you amazing yardage in the last few weeks, he's been bust proof. So he's earned my trust, definitely a top 10 tight end. But after last week's performance from Kincaid, I don't know if I can start him. Kincaid also gets a top 5 matchup. And then I still kind of trust some of those other names above him. Like, even though the matchup is bad for Tyler Warren, I'd still rather go Tyler Warren than Oronde Gadsden. The rookie, I think, at some point will fall back down to earth and probably not give you a touchdown every single week. So definitely want to start Gadsden. He's in my top 10, but I could see a slightly diminished return. If you told me this is a heavy field goal game against the Pittsburgh Steelers, wouldn't be shocked. I think Cameron Dicker and Chris Boswell are a bit safer endorsements than Gadsden to score touchdowns. So he's still top 10, not fading him at all, but I just can't put him above guys like Kincaid and Tyler Warren. I also can't endorse Mark Andrews any higher than number 9. Despite 2 touchdowns last week, he didn't have much volume other than those red zone targets, and Isaiah Likely is starting to factor in. If you don't get the touchdowns, the yardage is never really there for Andrews in a big way. There has been a long time since he consistently offers 50 plus yards. The stat line for Andrews is usually like 40 yards and a touchdown, and without that touchdown, you're kind of disappointed. So that's the reason Andrews is at the bottom of this tier. In general, the upside's a bit more touchdown dependent than some of the other guys who have great yardage outcomes, often recurring this season. So Andrews at number 9, still a tight end worth starting, but a bit too touchdown dependent to be ranked any higher. Starting at 10, now we're into the streaming conversation, and I think the high floor outcomes of guys like Schultz, Juwan Johnson, and Hunter Henry are the safest bets to be making. That Jaguars matchup is just so good, not just for Davis Mills, but especially for Dalton Schultz. He gets the 3rd best tight end matchup this week against Jacksonville. And in the last month, they're giving up over 22 points per game to the position. So if the touchdown hits for Schultz, you're going to be ecstatic because the yardage should be there. I expect a similar stat line to 2 weeks ago when he faced off against Seattle and he almost had 100 yards. I think he's getting close to 10 targets this week. So love the matchup. I think Davis Mills has a great game, and I trust that Schultz is going to be the number 2 target in this offense. I think the volume will be at least 7-8 targets, and a touchdown is not the worst bet. The Jags defense is pretty atrocious. So love the upgrade for Schultz. The floor, I think, is bust proof. He's my favorite streaming option, and I've endorsed him this high a few weeks ago against Seattle. That was also one of my best calls at this position in recent history. So like him a lot, want to start him. Last week, my start of the week was AJ Barner, and that did lead to double-digit fantasy points as well. I like Dalton Schultz. I think the floor is safe. I trust Davis Mills. Put Schultz in your lineup as a good streamer in week 10. At number 11, though, Juwan Johnson looks like he has a solid connection with Tyler Shuck. And the matchup against Carolina is not terrible. They've ranked top 13 on the year. And with no Rashid Shaheed, I think the volume is even more locked in for Juwan Johnson. So the Panthers have a good secondary that will definitely double team Chris Olave. And there's just so few other targets for the ball to go. Tyler Shuck has to throw it in Juwan Johnson's direction. So I think he's a safe floor play. Last week he had double-digit fantasy points, and I would expect somewhere close to that yet again. On volume alone, I think Juwan is going to give you about 6 receptions for somewhere around 50 to 65 yards. In this offense, the floor should be there. But limited upside, I wouldn't expect many touchdowns for Juwan rest of season, and because of that, I can't rank him top 10, but I like the matchup enough, and last week was encouraging. I think you're going to get the volume to cover you with Juwan Johnson rest of season. So consider him a solid flex option, but at tight end 11, I understand still keeping him on the bench. He should have a safe outcome this week. I think the floor is going to be there. Hunter Henry at number 12 is a little touchdown dependent though, and he sometimes gets vultured by Austin Hooper, so that's why he's at the bottom of this 3-person tier. But at number 12, I still see some good outcomes for him, especially with Kayshon Boutte going down. I think a touchdown for Hunter Henry is a bit more likely. But this Tampa Bay game is either going to be a massive shootout and there's plenty of touchdowns to go around, or it's low scoring and there's a lot of field goals that the offense will settle for against the Buccaneers. So Hunter Henry, I think, is more of a floor play in this game, but I do think the outcomes are relatively safe. I think he'll be a fine candidate to give you at least 5 receptions against Tampa. I think he'll have to step up because Booty is not expected to play. That is a very important part of this offense, and Hunter Henry is usually a top 3 target. So I'm expecting 6 targets, 5 catches. I think the connection will be there for Henry, and it should lead to at least 40, 55 yards for Hunter Henry. I think the floor is safe for at least 7.5 points. And if you get that coveted touchdown, you'll be very happy you started him. So in the top 12, I think Hunter Henry is a fine acquisition, a fine start. I'm giving him an upgrade this week because Kayshon Boutte is not expected to be healthy. At 13, though, we're dropping in a tier, and the streaming conversation is still relevant with these players, but the floor is just not as safe. So you're chasing touchdowns at this point, and it's not as good of a proposition. If you get burned without it, you may not get more than 5 points. I could see a very low floor, less than 40 yards for all of them. But there is still a reasonable argument to be making to stream them in your lineup. In that same Bucs Patriots game, I have Cade Otton versus New England. And with the injuries at receiver, Otton is still a pretty safe target in this offense. So touchdown can always go in his direction. There's always some upside, but if you tell me he gives you less than 35 yards, I also wouldn't be surprised at all. Sometimes Otton is just a floor play, and if not for good yardage, you do get screwed. So I'd rather go Hunter Henry. I'd rather go Juwan Johnson and Dalton Schultz. I see better matchups with higher volume going in their direction. But at 13, you could do way, way worse than Cade Otton. I think he's a fine floor play. I wouldn't feel terrified to go with Cade Otton. But at 14, I kind of feel like I'm a bit too low on Theo Johnson. At Chicago, the matchup isn't bad, and the weather could be a problem. But if it's not, the odds of a shootout are pretty high. The Bears defense, though, is much more vulnerable to wide receivers and running backs. If there's one position they cover relatively fine, it is tight end. So Theo Johnson has been a bit of a yo-yo option. If he doesn't score a touchdown, the yardage isn't very safe, and the floor just isn't really there. But the upside is amazing. However, I think this could be a week where Daniel Bellinger returns to the lineup, and if that happens, then the ceiling is a bit capped for Theo Johnson. So very touchdown dependent, but not a bad candidate to give you that. At 14, I think Theo Johnson is a fine start, but odds are I'd rather fade him. Odds are I think it's a bit too risky, because without the touchdown, you're probably getting less than 5 points. So good luck with Theo Johnson. High risk, high reward. If it works out, you'll be very happy. You could get 15 points, but without it, you might get less than 5. At 15, speaking of a high risk, high reward option, it's Kyle Pitts, who is never a safe endorsement. But if we're only looking at matchup stats, this Colts game is one you want to be starting a tight end against Indianapolis. It's been a good spot, especially in the last month. An average of 21.1 points per game would rank top 3 against the position, and Kyle Pitts should get an upgrade on paper against Indianapolis. If we go back to his London performances, first time he ever played in Europe, he had over 100 yards, and that was one of his best games of his career. It's possible he really steps up in the Europe time zone. So maybe Germany will be his good luck charm. Maybe there is some value here, but it's really just the matchup why I'd be interested at all. Otherwise, Kyle Pitts is not a safe bet. But Mooney has not stepped up at all. I would expect Sauce Gardner to really try and lock down Drake London. Wouldn't shock me if they double team London and somebody else has to step up. So Kyle Pitts, I think, will get the second most targets behind Drake London, but maybe this is just a heavy Bijan Robinson game. Maybe it doesn't work out at all. I would expect enough volume, though, to offer some upside. The yardage should be there for Kyle Pitts. It would not shock me if he finished the game with over 75 yards. I think that is the path for success with Pitts. I wouldn't expect a touchdown, but I think this is a game where they need him to step up, and I could see solid volume. He often runs some go routes and gets targeted down the field. If he picks up like 40 yards on one catch, that would really cover you. That'd be a very nice boost to his floor. So volume will be the key. If they don't trust Kyle Pitts, it will blow up in your face. But against the Colts, the matchup stats indicate the upside is there for Kyle Pitts. He should have a boost in value against Indianapolis. So if you're bold enough, go ahead and start him. But at 15, I would understand just keeping him on the wire, let alone your bench. It still feels a bit risky. I never feel too confident actually endorsing Kyle Pitts. As much as I want to rank him higher, this is the highest I could go. At 16, 17, I do think that the Browns tight ends are still relevant enough in the flex discussion to have some streaming value. I'd rather go Fannin Jr. because I think he's more involved in this offense. But Njoku should be fully healthy off the bye. He should be good to go. And he is not someone to dismiss in this offense. So the Cleveland Browns would much rather throw it to the tight end position than wide receiver. And in general, this Jets matchup is not the easiest for tight ends. There is typically about 10 points per game to be split against the Jets. So that is the problem. The fact that both of them are on the field, it caps their upside. You don't know for sure where the ball's going to go. And in the red zone, it's so important at tight end. If you pick the wrong one, you'll be upset. But I think both of them will be the main factors of this offense. Other than Quinshon Judkins, this is where the ball is generally going in Cleveland. So the Jets matchup isn't scary enough. I think they're fine options, but in general, the upside is a bit capped, and I don't feel great about starting Fannin or Njoku. But I do expect at least 6 targets for both of them. That should lead to a relatively safe floor. But the rest of the way, I'm going to be benching all these tight ends. They just don't feel safe enough. And maybe you've seen enough where you are willing to trust them, but I just don't think the sample size of success is good enough to really trust. And it generally comes in good matchups. I trust good matchups more than these players' track record, despite some of their elite production at times this year. Like last week, Colston Loveland had an amazing breakout game, but I just think it was the Bengals matchup, not really the rookie being a safe start going forward. So he has to prove it against a more average or difficult matchup. The Giants rank number 19 this season, and I don't think it's an upgrade anywhere close to the Bengals upgrade. So if he has another good game, then yeah, I'll trust him the rest of the way. But given he was a top 10 pick, at some point it'll work out. But I really just think it was the matchup why he had such a good game. If they tackled him, that second touchdown in the fourth quarter would not have happened, and he wouldn't have had the same amazing upside. It was the Bengals matchup, why he was so good. So not dying to endorse him, but it was impressive. At some point, he will step up. I did like Loveland a lot entering the season. He's just very young and unproven. Last week was encouraging though. At 19, we have Luke Musgrave expected to fill the shoes of Tucker Kraft. And it's funny because Musgrave was actually drafted above of Tucker Kraft. The Packers had more faith in Musgrave back on draft day a couple years ago. But Musgrave has been banged up. Kraft has stolen the opportunity. Musgrave, I'm sure, is hungry to get on the field and get some targets. So he could play well, but the matchup against the Eagles is bottom 3. I don't think he's proven enough to fully trust him, but this offense likes to throw it to tight end. There is value for the Packers tight end, and now it's Musgrave. So don't want to dismiss him. He's an okay option off the wire, but in the Eagles game, the matchup indicates it's not the spot you want to be trusting him. The upside should be capped. I wouldn't expect a touchdown for Musgrave, but a decent pickup, not my worst asset to be adding off the wire. At 20, we have AJ Barner versus Arizona. The matchup is solid, but because it's a time split with Elijah Arroyo and they just added Rashid Shaheed, it's a little too crowded for my liking. There's still Torrey Horton that also factors in behind JSN. So that's just a lot of other names to worry about. And the Cardinals looked good on defense. I could see it as a relatively low scoring game in division, but I still trust the Seahawks a decent amount. I think Barner is still my preferred tight end in Seattle, but at 20 this week, I doubt you're dying to start him. I liked him a lot last week and it paid off, but he also needed a tush-push touchdown for that to work out. I don't think the volume will be elite enough to cover you for over 6 points guaranteed. So would rather bench him, but at 20, there is some value. And then Ertz with no Terry McLaurin should have some targets, but with no Jaden Daniels, the value is definitely lower with Mariota. And then at 22, Mason Taylor will get some volume. The Browns matchup isn't atrociously bad, but on the season it is bottom 10, so not dying to start him, but the volume should be there. I still like Taylor to have some value behind Garrett Wilson. And then these next 5 scare me a lot this week. The matchups are tough, and in general, they're just floor plays, so not dying to trust them. We got Evan Engram versus Las Vegas, a bottom 4 matchup, so no thanks with him. Hockenson versus Baltimore is very touchdown dependent, and even last week with a touchdown, it wasn't worth your time, so not going to trust JJ McCarthy. I think you can drop Hockenson if you need the space. And then Jatavion at 25 could play well. The Saints matchup isn't terrible, but in general, I don't trust Bryce Young enough to offer safe value. Tyler Higbee does have the most value in the Rams tight end core, but it's pretty crowded there and they use all of them, so not going to trust him, needs a touchdown. And then at 27, Johnny Smith I think is the best Steelers tight end, but the matchup against the Chargers is bottom 6. I will fade him. Not sure if the ball is going to go to him or Pat Freiermuth. But 28 through 32, these backups I think are too risky to trust, but there's always elite upside. There could be a world where they offer you like 80 yards and a touchdown, and off the wire, nobody starts them, but there is high upside. I have Taysom Hill at 29. At some point, that breakout game is incoming. Isaiah Likely is starting to factor in more, but I'd still trust Mark Andrews a lot more. And then Terrence Ferguson getting some deep throws in his direction, but they still use Higbee, Davis Allen, and Colby Parkinson, so it's just too crowded. The second round pick, though, has more long-term value in this offense than any other tight end. And then Elijah Arroyo needs a deep shot touchdown. Last week was encouraging, but with the addition of Rashid Shaheed, I would assume his volume does diminish. And then Freiermuth does flip-flop between Jonnu Smith in the Rodgers offense. But I also have Dawson Knox, Austin Hooper, Daniel Bellinger, Cole Kmet, Michael Mayer, and Hunter Long at 33 through 38. And Hunter Long is actually a starter, but otherwise these backups are just vulture candidates. I wouldn't start any of them. Too risky to bet on. So that's it for my tight end rankings. Went a little deep. I would definitely be starting the top 12 with more confidence in the rest. I think once you hit Colston Loveland at 18, it feels a little bit too risky. I would rather fade them, but there is still a lot of upside with everyone. Tight end is very deep. You could literally pick up almost anyone off the wire and argue for them in your lineup. And I could argue that you're a crazy person. I could also argue that you know exactly what you're doing, and this is the right tight end to trust. So tight end, take your pick. It's literally like Baskin Robbins. There are 31 flavors at tight end that you could pick and literally have a good game. Tight end is very hit or miss, but in general, there's 20 different players that are worth starting any given week. At defense, though, let's run through the list. Defense is always kind of tricky, and sometimes it's all about matchups, but also how much risk you're willing to tolerate by not dropping a key asset. In my opinion, now that we're in the second half of the year, if you have one of those really talented defenses that have good personnel and also a good fantasy schedule down the stretch, I would not drop them because I'd rather be rostering 2 defenses than multiple tight ends. I think it's good to be flipping between multiple defenses on your roster. But if you do not have the space, if you can't afford that bench slot to be devoted to a second defense you're not starting, then just stick with the good defense that you're relying on. So let's go through the rankings. And at 1 and 2, I think this week it's a no-brainer. The Broncos versus Geno Smith should have 3 or 4 turnovers, and they've been on a lock in the lineup all season. So Broncos on Thursday night at home should be the best play of the week, 100% starting the Broncos against Geno Smith. But with Tyler Shuck making his second career start, I trust the Panthers defense at home against New Orleans. New Orleans does not scare me at all. And especially with no Shaheed, there's no upside in their offense. Barring an elite performance from Taysom Hill, there is no one to fear in the Saints offense. So got to start the Panthers. That is a no-brainer in division. The score is probably going to be less than 10 points from the Saints offense. But at 3 through 6, I think it's tier 2, and there's a little bit more risk. Sometimes their defenses just don't show up. However, the matchups I think are so good, I would trust them. The Bills at Miami usually are their kryptonite, and I don't think it's as close of a game as it was earlier this season on Thursday when the Dolphins came into Buffalo and covered the spread. Their offense, I think, will really shit the bed. I would expect Tua to throw some turnovers in this matchup. They don't have Waller, and that was the key for them last time. I do not think Miami is an offense to fear this week. So the Bills going to get at least 2+ turnovers. I think they really shut down the Dolphins offense. In Miami, they should play very well on defense. So love the Bills at 3. I think they're a must start. And then the Browns at the Jets. They're coming off a bye, and the Jets don't scare you at all. Last time we saw the Jets, they almost dropped 40 points, but the Browns are much better at stopping Breece Hall and any running back compared to Cincinnati. So Breece Hall not going to have a good game here. The Browns are a top 5 play. At the Jets, a very safe start against Justin Fields. But the Texans are one of the best defenses in the NFL. Without CJ Stroud, their defense should play well even more, and they will step up without their starting quarterback. So against the Jaguars offense, I do not fear Trevor Lawrence very much. ETN should have a decent game, but even though they traded for Jacoby Myers, I do not trust the passing game very much. So give me the Texans at home, especially. There should be a very low offensive outcome from the Jaguars. Very high floor from the Texans. The Lions at Washington, I think, want revenge from that playoff loss. They will play very well with Aiden Hutchinson healthy in this game. So love this matchup. If it was Jaden Daniels healthy, then maybe not as much. But against Mariota, I see a very good outcome here. High floor, high ceiling. I trust the Lions. If the final score is 40-10, would not shock me at all. So I like the Lions this week. I think they are very motivated to step up. And then 7 through 10, tier 3, I think have good enough matchups and are talented enough where I would start them more likely than not. The Seahawks, always a defense I want to hold on to. Even though the Cardinals offense played well, I think it was just the Cowboys matchup last week, not a glowing endorsement of Jacoby Brissett. So maybe I'm underestimating Brissett and Arizona, but I still trust Seattle's defense. They've looked really good all season, and I expect a lot of field goals in this one. I see more defense overall than offense. So start the Seahawks at home. The home field advantage is starting to come back to them, so I think they'll play pretty well. And then the Ravens at Minnesota, I think, have looked really good since their desperation has kicked in, and especially since the bye. I think they're a safer start. So Ravens against J.J. McCarthy have been a tough matchup for quarterbacks lately. I think they will get the bump in value against the rookie. McCarthy, I think, will turn it over at least once, if not twice. I think the Ravens are a solid floor play at defense. I think they're top 10 in week 10. At 9 and 10, I think the Sunday night game between the Steelers and Chargers is heavy on field goals. And I do think the Steelers will benefit from no Joe Alt and a very banged up O-line in LA. So like the sack potential for the Steelers, there's going to be at least one, if not multiple turnovers. Last week, they got 5 turnovers from Daniel Jones, as well as a fumble from Josh Downs. So 6 total turnovers. The Steelers have won multiple games with a lot of turnovers this year. And given their backs kind of against the wall as the Ravens are starting to wake up, the Steelers need to win, and they're going to do that with defense. So the Chargers kind of capped upside. I hate their offensive line struggles right now, and I just see a few problems where even they will settle for field goals. A lot of Cameron Dicker and Boswell in this game. For that reason, neither defense will give up more than 25 points. Give me a high floor for the Steelers and Chargers. I like the defenses in this one. They're both top 10. I think it'll be a close, low-scoring game, and I think both defenses have some upside. I like the Steelers and Chargers in the top 10. But 11 through 15, I'm going to trust the talent of these units. If I'm looking to the waiver wire, maybe I see higher upside with defenses like the Saints and Jets against teams like Carolina and Cleveland. But if you're telling me you want those defenses rest of season, I think you're wrong. I would rather have the talent of these next 5 teams and just stick with them in my lineup this week. I like the Bucs versus New England to keep it somewhat close. I have the Patriots right behind them. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is a very high shootout between Baker and Drake May. But both defenses have played very well in the last month. They're both bottom 5 matchups for opposing quarterbacks. And I do see some turnovers. I also see a lot of field goals settled on by both franchises. The weather's also weird in this game. A 30% chance of rain, a lot of humidity and 80+ degree weather. And I do think the Bucs eke out a win, a close one, but it's probably going to be like a 23-21 game rather than 38-35. So perhaps I'm wrong. Maybe both quarterbacks are just that good, but I think both defenses know the weight of this game, and I think they need the win to secure the division lead. So give me the Bucs at 11, Pats at number 12, and I think they're worth starting because of their talent level. They might not finish this high, but I think they will finish top 20. And if you're telling me the difference between 6 and 8 points is that worth it to you, then maybe you'll want to bench them. But I think the floor is safe enough where I would just start them and bite the bullet. I love the playoff schedule for the Buccaneers and rest of season other than the bye, the Bills and the Ravens game. The Patriots schedule is amazing. This is one of the few tough spots for them. And for those reasons, I would just stick with them in my lineup. If you don't have the space to carry a second defense, then just rock with them. They're talented enough where I would expect a high floor. I think they'll play well enough to be fine. At least 5-6 points is my projection for the Bucs and Pats. That's good enough to be worth a start. The Cardinals, I think, also impressed me with the addition of first-round pick Walter Nolan. I think they're a legit defense I don't want to dismiss. But Darnold and the Seahawks have looked good, and at home, I think they'll play pretty decently well. I don't think anyone's stopping JSN. So if the run game gets going, the floor for the Cardinals could be tricky. But in division, I think they'll keep it somewhat close. I think their defense will force at least one turnover. And the Seahawks have been a bit cursed. They have settled for a lot of field goals in home games. So I think it's also a relatively low-scoring game. I think the Seahawks will win by at least a touchdown, but I still think the final score is like 21-13, something not too crazy on the scoreboard. So give me the Cardinals in the top 15. I think they are worth a roster spot rest of season. I think they do have good personnel, and they are well coached on defense. Give me the Cardinals top 15. But that Eagles-Packers game might be such a high shootout. I might be dead wrong on this ranking, but I think both units are safe enough rest of season. They're both really talented. I would probably just stick with them. I'm a bit embarrassed to have them in the lineup because there is a lot of risk. But at 14-15, like I said, with the Bucs and Pats, I don't think dropping them is worth it. I want to be stashing good defenses. And especially with the trades that the Eagles just made on defense, they have really high upside, good floor production rest of the season. They are good and well coached. I still think they're top 15. Worth a start. Similar to the Bucs and Pats, I think a 5-point floor is probably worth just holding on to. So go ahead and start them. The game is going to be very close. I think it's going to be safe enough to get that 5-point floor. So if you're chasing 12 plus points, then maybe you'll look to the next 4 teams I'm going to mention. But in the top 15, I still think the Eagles, Packers, Bucs, Patriots, and Cardinals are probably too good to drop. I would still just hold on to them. If all I need is 4, 5, 6 points, I think that's what you'll get from these defenses. They're too good to drop. 16 and 17, though, I think have higher upside than 11 through 15. I think the Saints at Carolina could have a really good game. In division, it's probably a low score for both offenses. So they should play well, but they looked like shit last week against the Rams. So maybe you're not going to trust them. But in division, they should wake up. But perhaps they've already quit on the season. Their season is definitely over. And then the Jets, if it wasn't against Cleveland, I would rank way lower. With the trade of Sauce Gardner and Quinnen Williams, they might completely give up. But Dylan Gabriel is not someone you fear at all. So the Browns matchup is still good. I don't trust the Jets, though, especially with the trades. It feels way too risky. They've given up 30 plus points multiple times, and it could totally blow up in your face. But that's why I'd rather just go with the Bucs, Patriots, Cardinals, Eagles, and Packers. They feel way more talented, and despite a good matchup against the Browns, it feels like fool's gold with the Jets. So no thanks. If I can avoid it, I will. But the Rams at San Francisco are hungry for the win. Their defense is really talented, but the Niners offense is really tough. So I would also like to hold on to them, but I'd feel less comfortable starting them as opposed to the Packers or Eagles. I could put them in that tier 2 spots higher, but I would feel a bit risky against the Niners offense. I'd rather bench the Rams if I could. But Vikings versus Baltimore against Lamar Jackson, that feels really rough, but the Vikings are talented as well. Also feel kind of worth holding on to and not dropping. But I would understand picking them up later on and dropping them against Baltimore. I doubt someone picks them up against the Ravens. But the rest of the way, I'm definitely benching the rest of these 9 defenses. No thank you with the Falcons and Colts game. I think that game is really high scoring, a lot of rushing yards, so not many fumbles or interceptions. No thanks with the Falcons or Colts. And then the Jaguars and Niners, I just don't trust the Jags. Their defense has been atrocious. They gave up 4 touchdown passes to Geno Smith. Davis Mills will still play well. The Niners against the Rams, their defense is way too depleted. The Rams offense is too good, so no thanks there. But in division, maybe they step up. Maybe they have another couple fumble recoveries. And then the Bears-Giants game feels like a shootout, but there's some tricky weather in that game. If you tell me it's snowing, which is possible, I would probably bump them up above the Saints and Jets. But their defenses have looked so bad, it feels way too risky. It feels like it could totally blow up in your face. And I see much more shootout potential than a low-scoring game. But weather might be the only reason why they're worth it. I'd probably pass, though. They have not been safe enough to trust. The Bears and Giants, I think, are really bad on defense. Not going to trust them. Lastly, though, the matchup for the Raiders at Denver, fuck that shit. Broncos going to drop 40 probably. And then the Bills also probably drop 40. Same with the Lions. None of these defenses have any value. They probably give you negative points against the Broncos, Bills, and Lions. So that's it for this video. Those are my top 22 defense and tight end rankings here on the screen for your start sit consideration. If you still have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below. Really appreciate you joining the blunt rotation. So I'm starting the top 10 defenses with a lot of confidence. I think the floor is very high, but if you get outside the top 10, I'd rather just stick with the talent than good matchups. I'd rather just bite the bullet with the Bucs, Pats, Cardinals, Eagles, and Packers. Maybe even the Rams and Vikings might be better starts than the Saints and Jets. I don't think it's worth dropping the Bucs defense to stream the Saints at Carolina. It does not feel worth it, in my opinion. The rest of season schedule for a team like Tampa Bay is so valuable. Have you looked at their playoff schedule? They get New Orleans, Carolina, and Atlanta in the fantasy playoffs, all division games against some rough offenses. I love the value long-term. And at this stage of the season, you want to be stashing those elite value defenses. So that's why I like the Bucs at 11. I'm going to start them in one of my leagues. Even though I had the opportunity to go with the Saints, I passed. I could have even picked up the Browns and dropped the Bucs. I did not think it was worth it. I will go Tampa and just bite the bullet. Even against Drake May, I think it's worth it. So that's my strategy at the position. Outside the top 10, I would rather just trust talented defenses than chase low-end matchups. But those top 10 plays are definitely where it's at. Broncos and Panthers, no-brainers. Amazing matchups for them and good defensive personnel as well. Bills against Tua, that's a good spot. The Browns against Fields, that should be dope. Texans, always a good defense. And then the Lions want revenge against Washington. They should really play well against Mariota. Seahawks, always good. Ravens against McCarthy have looked much better. I like them this week. And they have great matchups in weeks 11 and 12. So they're a great stash. The Steelers and Charger game, I think, is a lot of field goals. So that's why I think they have good floor production in this week. But at tight end, the best names are all in your lineup. You got Bowers, McBride, LaPorta, Kittle, and Goedert in the top 5. Warren in a tough matchup still is top 6. Kincaid in a good matchup, a bit inconsistent, but probably in your lineup. Gadsden has been so good lately. The yardage is probably giving you another 70, 80 yards against Pittsburgh. That's a good matchup. And then Andrews is probably a lock for a touchdown yet again. But love the matchup for Schultz, Juwan Johnson, and Hunter Henry. I think the volume is very safe to bet on. Maybe no touchdown for them, but if you told me they all gave you 70 yards, I would not be shocked. I think they're in good situations, especially Schultz against Jacksonville. Their defense is trash right now. And then Juwan with no Shaheed should have safe volume. He's a go-to target in New Orleans. And then I also like Hunter Henry with no Kayshon Boutte to have higher touchdown odds against the Buccaneers. But Cade Otton should have some value, has had good yardage lately, and with no Evans or Godwin should step up. Theo Johnson is a bit boom bust, but a touchdown offers him some elite upside. The matchup is great for Kyle Pitts, but always a bit risky. The yardage, though, I think could be there. If he gives you 75 yards, wouldn't shock me that much, but Kyle Pitts is always a bit risky. And then, unfortunately, we have 2 tight ends in Cleveland, but they all are getting safe volume every week, so they're both in the streaming conversation every single week as well. But beyond that, it feels a bit too risky to trust. Loveland has to prove it again in a tougher matchup. Not my safest preferred play. Musgrave will get more volume with no Kraft, but the matchup sucks against the Eagles, so let's wait for him to prove it before we lock him into the lineup. Barner has to compete with Arroyo and now Shaheed, so a little unsafe against Arizona, but the matchup's not bad. Ertz with Mariota is never as exciting, so could play well with no Terry, but ideally I'd avoid him. And then Mason Taylor, just a volume monster. That is what you're hoping for. But the Browns could be a tough spot. And then Engram, Hockenson, Jatavion outside the top 22. I will fade them. The matchups are tough. And in general, they're just floor plays most of the time. So that's it for this video. That's it for both positions. And if you are still watching, Let me know in the comment section. I appreciate y'all for sticking around, and I'll see you next time. My name's Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.